I feel like I'm in very esteemed and intimidating company, and I should say that the translation of that work of Hegel or Spinoza, I think I really apprenticed myself to that text, and I'm kind of on the beginning of a long journey. So hopefully this will be helpful for me. The topic has changed a little bit, although the question I'm engaging is the same. Really what I'm trying to do is revisit the question of the constitution of what Spinoza calls the composite individual, with a new consideration following the invitation of Hosanna Sharp in Spinoza and the Politics of Renaturalization, that we consider, and I'm quoting, the conditions under which the desire for perseverance, human and non-human, combine and form enabling or disabling assemblages. And the first part of the paper, I want to revisit the various compulsions that animate a reconsideration of our relationship to the non-human world, with the idea that we can or indeed should form enabling assemblages with non-human others, as well as the challenges in mobilizing Spinoza to think through this possibility. In the second part, I explore some of the conceptual tools that might help think this kind of collaboration, with particular focus on the idea of the composite individual as a way of tracing our complex interdependencies with the non-human world. And then in the final section, I consider some of the difficulties in engaging the concept to think our relation to the non-human world, and the way that this, this engagement reveals both the promise and what I think is the challenge posed by Spinoza, that we think the body not, whether a simple body, a composite, or the whole of nature, not as a bounded object, but truly as a composition of forces. In a certain sense, what I'm trying to do here is resituate the question of a monstrous nature of Spinoza's time in our actuality. When Spinoza wrote Ethics in the 1600s, nearly half of the terrestrial biosphere was wild, without human settlement or substantial land use, but we now find ourselves in a very different world. One response that is gaining currency in this struggle is to frame our relation to the commons in terms of the rights of nature. For example, the rights of nature are enshrined in Article 71 of the Constitution of Ecuador, resulting in a recent court case where the provincial court of Loja, sorry for my Spanish, attempted Spanish.
What is it?
Loja. Ruled in favor of the Vilcabamba River, declaring, quote, its rights to existence and the maintenance of its vital cycles, structures and functions, and evolutionary processes, and finding that these had been violated through the dumping of construction detritus. Similarly, the founding of the Global Alliance of the Rights of Nature in 2010, including the well-established member organizations from United States, Panama, India, Ecuador, Australia, and Canada, suggests this thinking is gaining ground. Arguably, the attempt to enshrine rights of nature in a formal constitution mirror to some extent what might more properly be thought of the sentiment that constituted power might more properly reflect constitutive power, a formalization of the conditions for a maximal potentia. Additionally, another emerging trend in North America and Australia has been to turn to the practice of polyculture, shifts in agricultural production, what has been called passive farming, in attempt to recreate the synergistic relations between plants, animals, and insects, to increase productive capacities of the land, disconnect from agricultural supply chains, provide an independent means of livelihood, and quote-unquote heal the planet. I would say that these efforts are shot through with contradictions, and I hope that this paper will begin to expose them and explore them. It's not my intention to review the history of these efforts, but rather to propose that this movement introduces another layer of complexity into the question of the state, its composition in relation to our collaboration, not only with humans, but non-human others, or their relationship to nature, to use the common sense of the term. So my first question is, what might a newly imagined orientation of the state as an organizational form that might maximize potentia for humans, what might its orientation be to act as a vehicle for this relationship? Here I think we're presented with a kind of paradox. On the one hand, the state has focused struggles around biopolitics and politics, biopolitics and biopower with increasing intensity in a kind of neoliberal era. But rights discourses, which are one of the vehicles for this, are singularly unsuitable for rethinking our relation with non-human others or the rest of nature. Since the publication of Alexandre Machery's Individu et Communauté chez Spinoza in 1969, an animated debate has emerged around the characteristics of the state and its possibilities in Spinoza's political philosophy. Drawing on differently inflected readings of Spinoza's work, and on opposite sides of this debate are those who contend the state is nothing more than a thing, a convenience, or an aggregation of individuals, and those who see the state as an individual possessing a kind of, or participating in a kind of conatus. And I'm referring to Laurent Beauvais' work that I'm just beginning to read. So on the one hand, there's a liberal democratic reading of Spinoza, and I'm thinking here of Stephen Barbone or Stephen Smith, which we might say, following Balabar, betrays at its core the intrinsic difficulty which readers have in understanding a doctrine which virtually escapes or dismisses the basic antinomies of metaphysics and ethics arising from ontological dualism, individualism versus holism or organicism. These works entertain the fallacious assumption that individuals are logically and actually prior to the social wholes they inhabit. This is a position that's been critiqued by Warren Montag in The Soul is the Prison of the Body, or that the real can be understood as a construction moving from the simple to the complex. So some of the most exciting developments in this debate build on Machery's work, elaborating the characteristics of the social body and the ontological basis for thinking conatus, not merely at the level of individuals, but the social body. And I'm thinking of the work of Laurent Beauvais, of Carolyn Williams, Martin Negri's extensive writings on constituent power, constituted by the power of the multitude, Willie Gottschall's fusion rather than transfer of power, Taman and Lindsted's trembling organization against a formal order, Guattari's vision of desire for a more realistic, better organizer, a more realistic, better organizer and more skillful engineer than the raving rationalism of the present system. So the question for me is, as these works, I think, increasingly focus on ways of thinking about potentia and a kind of an organizational form, if not an order, that can be responsive and receptive to it, might we extend this attention to non-human others? Well, an interesting tactic in the arsenal to confront anthropogenic climate change and neoliberal destruction of nature in the commonly understood sense of the term, that is, bioenergetic processes that unfold without explicit or direct or perhaps conscious human intervention. I wonder what the ontological and political limits of this approach would be, that is, folding the rights of nature into a kind of the potentia of the human. We might argue that at the outset that in listing Spinoza, there are several objections that arise immediately against this line of thinking. The first would be that the rights of nature so enshrined contains within it a presumption of nature as a harmonious whole, quite at odds with Spinoza's insistence on nature's amorality, nature as a process without principles or goals. This idea of a harmonious whole was the problematic, if implicit, assumption of André Naes, who is the founder of the deep ecology movement, and who drew on Spinoza's work to promote a view of nature, and I'm quoting here, not as passive, dead, or value-neutral nature of mechanistic science, but akin to the active, perfect deus sive natura. But Naes was unable to, from this position, to produce anything as viable as an ethics, either in his stance on biocentric egalitarianism, which on its own could not promise its purported goal of maximal biodiversity, nor through his preemptive qualification of a principle where he suggested that, and I'm quoting here, any realistic praxis necessitates, of course, some killing, exploitation, and suppression. So it's not surprising then that Genevieve Lloyd declares that anyone who looks to ethics for a viable, coherent metaphysical system to ground a belief in the rights of the non-human will look in vain. Moreover, concerning questions of social organization and sovereignty, Spinoza focuses almost exclusively on the utility derived from collaborations between humans, as importantly, individuals of a like nature or of the same species. And I'm referring here to Ethics 4, Appendix 9, Ethics 4 Appendix, and Ethics 4, Proposition 31. The idea that individuals of a like nature maximize capacity for all, although he further stipulates that these must be fellow men led by reason, as this is the only condition under which he considers men to be both truly active and of a like nature. So even in cases when men are troublesome to one another, however, a social life with other humans would be to Spinoza preferable to a misanthropy, a life of untutored rusticity, and this is I get from Ethics 4. His attitude towards beasts is based entirely on natural right, and he grants that men have far greater rights in terms of virtue, power, or potentia over beasts than beasts over men. Balabar, I think, emphasizes this restriction, arguing that Spinoza was particularly concerned with the difficulty, but also the ethical necessity of restricting the process of association to a causal understanding of the human body, which Balabar sees as a central aspect, and I would agree, of Book 5 of Ethics. And this against two common excesses or confusions of being. On the one hand, he points out the identification with animals in a zoophilia or zoophobia, and on the other hand, an anthropomorphic idealization of God, idea of God as a benevolent or malevolent figure. So why should we proceed with Spinoza? You might ask. I would say that cautioning against misidentification is not, which I think Balabar does, is not the same as finding grounds for association, and there are grounds to suggest Spinoza's framework might be a useful starting point to engage questions of relations to non-human others. However, a relation not based on identity or rights, but in terms of a composition of forces. Spinoza, to say that he focused principally on collaborations between humans is not to suggest broader interconnections are unimportant, although these indications in his text are arguably fleeting. In the Political Treatise, for instance, he argues, the natural right, potentia of specific to human beings, can scarcely be conceived except where men have their rights in common and can successfully defend the territories that they cultivate and inhabit, repel all force, and live in accordance with judgment of the entire community. And in Ethics 4, Proposition 18 in the Scholia, he argues, there are many things outside of ourselves which are advantageous to us and therefore to be sought. Although none of these, none more excellent can be discovered than things in harmony with our nature, and by that he means the nature of man. But more significantly, I think there's Spinoza's own naturalism, which might be broadly understood as a powerfully structured principle of causality, accounting for the production of the diverse, but also its compositions as diverse and non-totalizable combinations between elements of nature. And this is the way Deleuze describes his work. So here, the concept of the composite individual, with the understanding that all individual bodies are also composites, I think becomes useful. The basis for a coherence of a composite individual does not depend on beings of a like nature, Spinoza's prerequisite for collaboration between humans, but can be composed, and I'm quoting here, of several individual things of different natures, affected in many other ways while still preserving its nature. And this is from Ethics 2, the Scholia of Proposition 13. Insofar as each is a constituent part, retains its own motion, and continues to communicate its own motion to other parts. So this whole 2 pages following Proposition 13 in Ethics 2, I find both exciting and disturbing. Exciting because it presents the possibility of a way of thinking a collaboration of humans with non-human others, individuals composed of several things of different natures. And disturbing because I think in this short passage and the difficulty it raises, it becomes enlisted in an arsenal to support very divergent, if not antipodal, reading of Spinoza's ethics. I don't want to suggest here that there is maybe a singular true reading of Spinoza as a kind of theology, kind of the Bible says, because Spinoza said here, but rather following Althusser, who drew on Spinoza himself, that no work is free from ideology, and perhaps some readers of Spinoza are better at separating out, or rather working through what appear to be inadequate ideas to produce a true knowledge than others. So some of the interpretations I see as of this particular passage, I think is very productive passage. I see as attempts to kind of contain a monstrous nature, to exercise power over nature. For instance, in Stephen Barboni's insistent focus on the boundedness of the organism and an insistence that Spinoza's concept of the individual replies restrictively either to human individuals or the whole of nature, but nothing in between. Or others who suggest that Spinoza only intended the composite individual to apply to something like organisms. And I'm thinking here of the work of Jonathan Bennett, who also supports a physicalist reading of Spinoza, with the idea that with a more sophisticated science, one might make nature calculable. One might track the passage from the simplest bodies to composites in a field metaphysics, which is his term, wherein extended modes are understood as a kind of continuous string of space-time. There's also the attempt to define natural processes through what you might think of as a process of figuration, of describing a figure, which is reminiscent of, whose problems are reminiscent of Spinoza's critique of determination in his letter to Gelles, where the focus is on the appearance of a landscape or its visual boundaries, the kind of figuration of the thing, where the thing is defined not by its being or what it does, but rather by its non-being or its boundaries. So I see some of the attempts in current defense of so-called nature, circumscribing areas as protected zones, coral reefs, sensitive habitats, while laudable, I think, fall into this kind of problematic strategy. So in his definition of the composite individual, I think Spinoza presents us with a series of problems that are not entirely resolved, and that, moreover, present challenges to contemporary human forms of territorial organization. Moreover, Macherey will argue in Volume 2 of L'Introduction à l'éthique that a composite individual cannot be built up or aggregated from the most simple bodies, corporibus simplissimus.
Simplicissima.
Good. Simplicissima. Distinguished solely by their difference in motion and rest, that these are in fact beings of reason and not real beings. That is, they do not provide a genetic definition of the production of the real. The most simple bodies do not correspond to the most simple elements of existence, but rather, and I'm quoting here from Macherey, our most simple point of view. And it's perhaps telling that these simple bodies, I won't attempt the Latin again, as opposed to res singularis, appear only twice in the Ethics in these particular passages. The problem, as Macherey argues, is that to move from the simplest bodies as an additive, aggregated to all of infinity, the whole of nature, one attempts to construct the infinite whole from numerical parts, giving, as he says, a platform to the illusions of imagination, which install itself in this place that is opened up by a regression to the infinite. This, and I love this phrase, this et cetera that is the veritable passageway of ignorance. And that's the end of the quote. At the other end, you might see that the whole of nature or the entire universe, starting from the whole of nature or the entire universe in an attempt to divide it into parts, the inverse problem appears, as if one tries to simply divide the infinite into a series of parts. In a more cryptic summation, Balabar will refer to both simple bodies and the whole of nature as boundary comments. So how then to think the composite individual that is neither an addition of simple bodies ad infinitum nor a division of the infinite into the finite, the whole of nature into constituent parts? How much more time? Okay. Reflecting on the passages of the composite body in relation to Spinoza's writing on conatus, Deleuze elaborates a differentiated manner in which conatus is expressed through the modes. In simple, we might say here, meaning inorganic and in more complex bodies. Conatus, contra some readings, is not a desire for self-preservation. Spinoza would insist on the absurdity of this interpretation in chapter 5 of the Principles of Cartesian Philosophy in a discussion of, and I hope I'm getting that pronunciation right, conatus, when expressed in motion and rest. And And he says, were conatus, for instance, the desire of something to preserve its state of being in motion, we would find ourselves in an endless regression of desire to preserve the desire, to preserve the desire, to preserve the motion. So conatus then is the manner in which an individual perseveres in motion and rest, in passivity or activity, not the desire for that perseverance. It is nothing other than the capacity itself, nothing other, and this is from Ethics 3, Proposition 7, nothing other than its actual essence. A definition, as Warren Montag points out, rules out any finalism, immanent or transcendent. The thing is not striving to realize its essence or potential. The essence of the thing coincides entirely with its actual existence and has no meaning outside of that existence. Nor is it peculiar to human or even animate existence. It is neither instinct nor voluntary or animal motion. And that's from Warren Montag. So simple bodies, in this case, meaning not corpora simplicissima, but rather rocks or stones, for example, are determined to motion and rest. The mechanical characteristics of conatus. Complex bodies are determined through a range of active and passive affections that define their essence. So if we accept the argument then that conatus is nothing more than the tendency for such a composite individual to persist, we can see how Barbonne's objection to Macherey, to say that the state is no different than a pile of stones or a school of fish, begins to unravel, not only in relation to the state, but also on its own terms. Barbonne rejects Macherey's view that political states are individuals on the grounds that political institutions take second place in importance to individuals that live in them. The state exists for the benefit of each individual. It cannot be the case individuals exist for the benefit of the state. However, if conatus carries no implication of intentionality, of existence for something, but is rather the effect of a reciprocity rather than intention, you can see Barbonne's objection begins to dissolve. So what interests me here are the implications for thinking other forms of composite individual. If we cannot arbitrarily assign a durational threshold to the composite body, there's no reason then to extend this concept to other configurations, the transience of a school of fish, a herd of cattle, a flock of birds, not because the school has a conatus, but rather because it expresses conatus. Fish, cattle, birds have capacity to school, herd, or flock. Barbonne would counter by saying, well, by joining in a school, each fish maximizes its chances of survival. But to separate, maximizes its chances of survival, but it does this, and so it might better exist and operate as a particular fish, not as a school. In this reading, however, once again, maybe to belabor the point, he substitutes intentionality and preference for capacity. We might argue, on the contrary, that schooling, as much as capacity to forage and hunt on its own, are affects of the fish. Moreover, to separate the fish from this capacity would, to borrow from Spinoza's discussion of the Spanish poet, cause it to assume another nature quite different from its own. There are other examples of collaborative associations, I think, that allow us to think the composite individual beyond the boundaries of the organism. Recent studies using radioactive tracing to track back biochemical connections between trees of the same species have demonstrated preferential connections, interestingly, between so-called parent trees and their so-called offspring, their genetic offspring. They only will send nourishment through their root systems to their saplings, which are limited in the production of nutrients due to a lack of access of sunlight. Other studies have determined that certain species, plants from the same so-called parent, limit the expansion of their root system into a sibling's territory, but not into a non-sibling. So these examples offer a much more precise and I think a materialist understanding of the effective connections between beings of a like nature that are not human. So to return to the definition of conatus as a tendency to persist in the composite individual and abandoning any compulsion for identity, the need for this to be same species, or some idea of a direct reciprocity between two things, avoiding any implication of intention or desire of self-preservation, The characteristics, I think, of a composite individual as expressed in biodynamic systems begin to become a bit clearer. Treated as individual species or monocultures, biodynamic systems, I think we find in a perpetual state of degradation, needing to be shored up from the outside with constant inputs of fertilizer, pesticides, and the like. Organized as composites, they become more integrated as they become more complex. And I can think of examples in farming practices ranging in scale and complexity from simple plant guilds to an emerging practice in forest agriculture, polyculture, or the kind of what in plant biology is called the, I'm forgetting, but the old growth forest reaches a kind of a stable and steady position. But these images actually downplay a complexity, which is the composite individual thought through biodynamic systems does not readily adhere to a kind of a boundary, the way we think the boundary of the individual organism. It has much more complexity. In Yellowstone National Park, for instance, the reintroduction of wolves into the park had an unexpected effect of amplifying the biodiversity of the entire system, even changing the course of rivers. And there's a wonderful YouTube by George Monbiot called How Wolves Change Rivers. Wolf populations kept deer in check, limiting trampling of vegetation, slowing course of rivers, encouraging marshlands, and the arrival of a constellation of interdependent species. These images, I think, increasingly popularized in the media, however, also downplay the challenges. The stability is hard won. These so-called natural systems continuously exceed their boundaries. The wolves run out of the park and have to be shot in agricultural lands. The boundaries are constantly fragmenting and fractalizing, decomposing and recomposing, both in their interiors and at their edges. Not contented to abide by our delineation as self-contained units or regions, but tied into complex global systems. Changes in wind patterns, migration of species in and out of regions, drift of pesticides, a battle along a multiplicity of interiors and exteriors to maintain coherence. I'm afraid I can only end here on a note of kind of ambiguity or uncertainty. In the 21st century, as anthropogenic climate change threatens human existence in parts of the globe, the state has become a key site of the struggle around biopower and biopolitics, expressed in competing views of bioenergetic processes, alternatively as a dispositif of command and management and domination, the commodification of life, or as a site of creativity and becoming. But the attention to our impacts on and the relationship with natural processes and non-human others suggests the need for a more dramatic transformation of our systems of governance than tacking nature on, either in mobilizing discourses based on rights or in circumscribing natural zones through the delimitation of territory. I feel here I've only scratched the surface of the issue, outlining in a small way the contours of the problem rather than the possibilities for a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, for this bold attempt at translating the Spinoza's paradigm into the critical comprehension of environmental problematic. I'm sure that your paper gave rise to a huge number of questions.
I have a question, but not first. Well, I talk a lot, so there's someone else. Thanks. Very interesting, of course, and the whole thing shows, if it was needed, that not only there is a relationship between metaphysics and politics, but the metaphysics is politics. Yes. Certainly in the early modern period, but even up to us. My question is on two concepts that are absent, if I take it, I might be wrong, but in your paper, you barely or not at all mention the idea of transindividuality. Am I right?
I cut that out. Yeah, I'm still wrestling with that. And the reason is that I think in Balabar's, in what I understand transit individuality to be the condition that induces both differentiation and integration simultaneously. I'm still trying to get my head around how one might think. I can understand that at the level of the organism quite well, but at the level of the composite individual, things start to become unclear to me at the moment. So it isn't that I don't want to engage it, it's just I'm not yet certain how one thinks that.
You say it works among individuals, but not within the individual.
Well, it may be that, I guess a couple of things. First of all, I'm not really sure if the concept that I've chosen, the composite individual, actually betrays the problem I'm trying to overcome, which is the kind of additive of things to make an individual, or whether one can think of it, or I'm not sure yet how to think of it in a kind of way of differentiating, in the Deleuzian sense of differentiation. Partly because the discourse on protection around nature is all about adding things and taking things away, and bringing the wolves in or getting rid of the pesticides. So I haven't really, partly I haven't really, and this is another absence maybe you're going to point out, but I've kind of taken the human out of the equation, which is really, I don't mean to do that. And certainly one of the things I wanted to say was in the rights of nature, a lot of the so-called rights of nature seem to be emerging in places where people engage with and rely on what we call passive but are biodynamic systems, so indigenous peoples. So it's a different way of composing the human with the non-human than what we do in the West or our sort of big monoculture systems. Yeah.
Filippo, when you spoke of transindividuality, do you mean it only at the level of the human, or was your implication that one could apply the structure of transindividuality to the non-human?
I think you would have to. I think you would have to, yeah, I think you're right. I just haven't yet been able to think.
But the answer, of course, it points to the second part of my question. You also do not use, if I'm correct, ever the notion of subject, with which I totally agree, and this stems out of a discussion I've been having with Caroline.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
And I totally agree with that, but do you think one can use the subject in a Spinozist framework, or the individual as an individual?
You mean, well, if the subject implies any degree of intentionality, and I see this a lot. I've been reading a lot of the literature on biosemiosis, and they fall into that, like the plant wants to do this, or the I'm not sure. I guess what my hesitation is, I'm thinking of Deleuze, when Deleuze talks about, and I'm remembering this badly, but he talks about certain beings as having this interval between perception and reaction, in which a kind of a modulation of response is possible, which implies a certain kind of subjectivity, if you want, a possibility of changing one's orientation. And certainly you find that obviously in humans, although it's still, I don't know. I think generally not. I wouldn't use that, partly because this sort of problematics that we're facing in thinking our relation to non-human others are the falling out of synchronization of so many natural sort of compositional processes in nature that we've taken for granted. So I don't know if the subject is very helpful in thinking that. But maybe I misunderstand that.
I guess my sort of contribution here is a comment that also I think the perception of your paper regarding the sort of mutation and the speed of change of nature in our time And I think our experience of that mutation and speed of change implies that we have to consider our role and our place in the order of things, in the order of nature. And I think the advantage of the trans individual is not so much that it can encompass the relation between human and non-human, but that at a sort of pre-individual level, it can attend to the force and the development of things as a kind of combination, a field of forces, if you like. And I think in that sense, it allows us to think about the subject or consciousness as inseparable from the outside. That we can't think consciousness unless it's part of this global structure of the power to act, the force of things. So I think that's the centrality of Spinoza to these discussions around nature is that we cannot separate the experience of the subjective from nature itself. And I think I'm grappling with the same problem, really.
Yeah, I guess one of the reasons I probably did not try to avoid that whole question was that, and maybe I'm repeating myself here, but the tendency in a lot of the work on organic processes to make into subjects, even at the level if you look at, and it's a new language infiltrating even chemistry, it wanted to do this or wanted to do that. So I'm wondering about. I want to be very careful at what does subjectivity mean and how do we attribute it, and But I take your point that I've kind of left certainly human subjectivity and definitely the subjectivity of other cognate beings out of the equation.
I think it's the issue is about differentiating between subjectivity, which is consciousness, it involves intentionality, as you said, right, and thought, which is unconscious. And when we speak of Spinoza's pantheism, what we mean is precisely that everything, the rock, the table, whatever, is a signifier. Everything is a signifier. The whole is a signifier. So the whole universe involves the signifier. That doesn't mean it has consciousness.
Right.
So it's a distinction between unconscious thought and that you say
and
signification.
Signification.
Exactly.
No, I understand that, and certainly that. I've been also drawing on the work of Charles Saunders Peirce, and which is quite provocative around thinking that signification.
Right. So my point is, you can never claim the plant wanted. Yes, there is thought in the plant, but the plant cannot want.
Right. Well, and similarly, in renaturalizing the human, a lot of what we take for thought is in fact not.
Right.
Yeah.
Any further question? No?
Can I leave one? I wonder where the moment of monstrosity enters in your presentation. And I mean, it's not just because we have a conference on monstrous, but also because I think it is quite interesting to try and find. If I had to make a guess, and obviously I want your opinion, but I like from listening to that, I just cannot help feeling that this idea that nature is amoral, but not in a Nietzschean sense. I think that can be deeply or become deeply monstrous.
I had thought of it more in this monstrosity as, and actually going back to something you said, Andrea, at the very beginning, the attempt to, the fact that nature defies containment. It's constantly transgressing what the human attempt to bound it. So, yeah. So I was thinking even to go, the simple question of the rights of rivers. I was thinking, well, they haven't really thought this through, because what about when the river, floods a settlement? Is the right of the river okay then? Like there are lots of ways that
But isn't the human attempt to actually bound rivers, let's say you build dams, right? And then the dam overflows and floods the valley underneath. Isn't actually the monstrosity of the damming of the river in the first place?
Yes, I would think of it as a kind of an attempt to dominate or contain a monstrosity. Yeah, maybe, you could look at it either way,
Or maybe
I guess.
you found the monstrosity by
Yeah.
actually doing that.
Yeah.
But all this involves final causes. You cannot define the monster in Spinoza through final causes, right?
Through effects, yeah.
It's through final
Yeah.
causes. This
Yeah.
is imaginary for Spinoza, so
yeah.
it doesn't matter. As far as Spinoza is concerned, the river, the humans, who cares? you cannot produce ecological arguments through Spinoza, through these logical things. That's impossible. Right?
Any question? No? Okay, then we can, that's it, take again.